It began with an idea. Not just ink on parchment, not just 13 colonies demanding separation from a distant king, but a vision that would echo beyond borders, beyond centuries, and eventually beyond Earth itself. When the Founding Fathers signed the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, they had no way of knowing that nearly 2 centuries later, the very same spirit of liberty would be printed not just on paper, but on mission patches sewn onto astronaut suits and carried literally into the stars. The connection between that historic moment and the vastness of the cosmos may not be obvious at first, but step back and look again, and the parallels start to reveal themselves. What was the American Revolution, if not a daring leap into the unknown? What is space exploration, if not the modern-day frontier of human courage, innovation, and belief in freedom's potential? There's something fitting, almost poetic, about the fact that the first and only flag planted on the moon is an American one. It's not just a symbol of achievement, but a reminder that the same nation which once declared itself free beneath fireworks and colonial stars would one day look up at the real stars and find a way to reach them. In the early days of the American Republic, the language of the cosmos was already quietly seeping into public imagination. Thomas Paine, a voice of revolution, wrote in his 1794 essay, The Age of Reason, that the heavens declare the glory of God, and envisioned a universe not of divine mystery alone, but of human inquiry. Paine argued that science, reason, and exploration were essential to liberty, and in that sense, his words seem to prefigure the rocket trails and orbital charts that would someday mark America's journey beyond Earth. As the centuries turned, the idea of liberty expanded, and so did the scale of America's ambition. The same drive that built railroads across the continent, that electrified cities, that sent radio waves through the air, eventually turned its gaze upward. And when the space age dawned, it was not coincidence that it was framed in terms of national identity and ideological struggle. The space race was as much about freedom as it was about technology. In 1961, when President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and declared that America would send a man to the moon before the decade was out, he wasn't just making a scientific commitment. He was making a statement about who the nation was and what it stood for. We choose to go to the moon, he said, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. That ethos of ambition over convenience, of purpose over comfort, could just as well describe the men who signed the Declaration in Philadelphia, risking everything for a new future. And it wasn't just rhetoric. When the Apollo 11 mission touched down on the moon in July 1969, the entire operation was draped in symbolism. The lunar module was named Eagle, the very bird that crowns the Great Seal of the United States. Neil Armstrong's first words upon landing referenced not just NASA, but all of mankind, yet the first thing unfurled on that dusty surface was the stars and stripes. It was more than national pride. It was a statement that exploration, like independence, requires boldness, resolve, and the belief that tomorrow is worth risking today. In fact, the plaque left behind on the moon didn't boast of conquest. It read, "We came in peace for all mankind." That message, placed there by American hands, echoed the founding ideal that liberty once claimed must be offered outward, shared, not hoarded. Throughout the Cold War, space continued to be a canvas upon which America painted its aspirations. While missiles threatened from silos and ideologies clashed on Earth, astronauts floated above the conflict, weightless in a fragile vessel that depended on cooperation, precision, and trust. In some ways, space became the ultimate test of freedom. Not just freedom from tyranny, but freedom to imagine, to create, to discover, to risk something impossible. And as America matured, so too did its space programs. From the shuttles of the 1980s to the international partnerships of the ISS, the theme that endured was not domination, but direction. Each mission built upon the last, not just in scientific achievement, but in philosophical purpose. It was as if the rockets carried not only instruments and astronauts, but also fragments of that original declaration that all people are created equal and that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of the unknown. But perhaps the most compelling connection between the 4th of July and the cosmos lies not in what we've done, but in what we continue to reach for. Just as the founders envisioned a country that could outlive kings and borders, NASA and its modern successors envision a presence beyond Earth, on Mars, on moons, in orbit, in mind. Independence in the 21st century might not mean shaking off a monarch, but liberating ourselves from planetary limits, from narrow thinking, from believing we are bound forever to the dirt beneath our feet. Even today, on every 4th of July, as fireworks arc through the night sky, mimicking the trajectories of rockets and satellites, Americans look upward. It's more than a celebration of what was. It's a gesture toward what might be. Each burst of light echoes that first spark of rebellion, that first dream of a nation built not on bloodline but on boldness. And as private companies like SpaceX launch payloads into orbit from American soil, often returning boosters that land with the precision of ballet, the story continues. These modern missions are not detached from history. They are its latest chapter. The names may have changed, from Armstrong to Musk, from Mercury to Artemis, but the thread remains. A desire to break the known, to reach beyond the line drawn yesterday, and to make that reach a collective act of will. So what, then, is the link between Independence Day and interstellar ambition? It's this: both are declarations. One etched on parchment, the other carved in rocket flame across the silence of space. Both proclaim that we are not satisfied with what is, that we demand what could be, that we believe in a destiny not handed down, but chosen. As the sun sets on the 4th of July, and the sky fades to the deep velvet of space, perhaps that's the perfect moment to remember. Freedom doesn't end at borders, and neither does imagination. And so, beneath the very stars that guided those first revolutionaries, and now guide spacecraft, America continues its ascent. Not just into the sky, but into its own future. It was July 20th, 1969, just 2 weeks after the nation had once again celebrated its independence with fireworks and parades. Another kind of spectacle unfolded, not in the skies above Washington, but on the pale, silent surface of the moon. For the first time in history, a human being stepped onto another world. And though Neil Armstrong's voice carried the weight of all humanity in his famous line, there was one unmistakable symbol planted in the dust: the flag of the United States. The image of that flag, slightly stiffened to appear as if it were waving despite the airless vacuum, became one of the most iconic photographs of the 20th century. But it was more than a photo opportunity. In the context of American identity, that fabric, fluttering without wind, carried layers of meaning: innovation, perseverance, pride, and a willingness to lead not by force, but by example. The decision to place the American flag on the moon wasn't taken lightly. It was debated, argued over, and finally approved with the understanding that it was not a claim of ownership, but a gesture of presence. The plaque affixed to the lunar lander said it best: "We came in peace for all mankind." And yet, in the heat of the space race, with the Soviet Union watching closely, the message was clear. America had done something no other nation had. It had turned its dreams into footprints. What many forget is how complex this achievement was, not just technologically, but politically. The moon landing occurred at a time of great turmoil within the United States. Protests, assassinations, civil unrest. And yet, even amid this, the country came together to watch a black and white transmission from 250,000 miles away. In that moment, the flag was more than cloth. It was a mirror, reflecting what America could be when it reached upward, united, daring, imaginative. And while the moon bore no cities, no rivers, no borders, it now bore a silent witness to human ambition and to the American idea that liberty and progress were not mutually exclusive. That exploration was an extension of self-determination. That the frontier, even in the vacuum of space, still belonged to those bold enough to cross it. The symbolism of that flag reached far beyond geopolitics. It tapped into a deeper narrative that had always pulsed through American culture, that of the frontier. From the first settlers crossing the Appalachian Mountains to the pioneers moving westward in covered wagons, the idea of forging ahead into the unknown had become central to the American mythos. The moon was simply the next chapter. It wasn't conquest, it was continuation. President John F. Kennedy's famous 1962 speech at Rice University, in which he proclaimed, "We choose to go to the moon," wasn't merely a policy statement. It was a call to national character. In choosing a goal not because it was easy, but because it was hard, America wasn't just flexing its technological muscle. It was reaffirming its belief that challenges were meant to be met with ingenuity and courage, the same values enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. The act of planting the flag, then, was more than ceremonial. It was existential. It said, "We are here, not to conquer, but to connect, not to dominate, but to demonstrate." That in the vast silence of space, the voice of a free people could still be heard, in every signal sent, in every step taken, in every shadow cast by that red, white, and blue emblem. It's worth remembering that the flag didn't travel alone. Alongside it went scientific instruments, memorials to fallen astronauts, and a silicon disc inscribed with messages from dozens of world leaders. Even in its most patriotic moment, America understood the power of collaboration. The moon, after all, belongs to no one, and yet it now carries a piece of America, not just in hardware, but in hope. In classrooms across the country, children watched the broadcast with wide eyes. Some would grow up to become scientists, engineers, even astronauts. Others would simply carry with them the memory that their country had done something extraordinary, that on a distant world, in a place untouched by war or politics or time, an idea had been planted, not just a flag. And in the decades that followed, that idea would echo in rovers, in probes, in telescopes, in the drive to understand, in the refusal to stop reaching. Of course, time has taken its toll. The original flags planted by Apollo astronauts, including the one from that first mission, have likely been bleached white by relentless solar radiation. The fabric, once bold and proud, may now hang colorless, its threads slowly fraying in the vacuum. And yet, the moment remains. What mattered was never the flag itself, but what it stood for in that instant when it pierced the lunar soil. That moment was America telling the universe, in its own quiet way, we are willing to go farther, not for territory or power, but because knowledge, like freedom, is something worth pursuing without borders. The moon has since been visited by robotic scouts from other nations. China, India, and others have left their own footprints and tire tracks on its surface. But the legacy of that first flag endures. It was the punctuation mark at the end of a decade of trial and ambition. It turned a symbol of earthly identity into a universal gesture, one that said humanity could rise above its limitations and that America would lead that ascent. In the modern era, as private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin join NASA in planning new lunar missions, the flag may fly again on the moon. But its meaning has shifted. No longer a signal in the Cold War, it is now a torch passed forward, a reminder of what's possible when a nation dares to dream beyond the horizon. July 20th is not officially a holiday. It is not marked with fireworks or speeches, but in many ways, it is as patriotic as the 4th of July. Because on that day, America didn't just declare independence, it declared intention. The intention to explore, to endure, and to inspire. And even now, as we gaze at the moon with the naked eye, it's hard not to feel a flicker of that same spirit, that quiet, enduring pride that once against all odds we went there and left behind a flag not just for us, but for all who dare to follow. There was a time, not long after the smoke of World War II had cleared, when the skies above America seemed less like a ceiling and more like an invitation. The world had split into two superpowers, and each was vying not just for dominance on Earth, but for primacy beyond it. The Cold War wasn't only a standoff of nuclear threats or political ideologies. It was also a technological contest, one that would unfold not just in battlefields, but in laboratories, launch pads, and orbit. And it began with a shock. On October 4th, 1957, a metallic sphere named Sputnik pierced the night sky over the Western world. Launched by the Soviet Union, it was the first artificial satellite, a 183-pound beep of triumph from the other side of the Iron Curtain. To many Americans, it was a wake-up call. Suddenly, outer space felt uncomfortably close. If the Soviets could launch a satellite, what else could they launch? What followed was a wave of urgency. America, stunned but not broken, responded with resolve. Just months later, in 1958, it established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. It wasn't just a bureaucratic reshuffling, it was a declaration that the United States would not be left behind in this new frontier. And so began the space race, a campaign of accelerated innovation, national pride, and geopolitical messaging. It wasn't merely about getting to space. It was about what getting there meant. Every orbit, every trajectory, every data transmission was symbolic, a measure not just of scientific prowess, but of ideological superiority. The early years were rocky. The Soviet Union sent the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into space in 1961. His flight was brief but momentous, a single loop around the Earth that ignited headlines and ignited fear. America had yet to send a man beyond the atmosphere, but the response was swift, bold, and deeply American in its scale. President John F. Kennedy stepped to a podium that same year and said, with unwavering clarity, that the United States would go to the moon. Not because it was easy, but because it was hard. That speech marked a pivot, a line in the sand and in the stars. America was not just reacting anymore. It was reaching toward the moon, reaching toward a vision that said freedom, ambition, and ingenuity were not just national values, they were cosmic ones. To meet Kennedy's challenge, NASA launched Project Mercury, followed by Project Gemini, stepping stones toward the lunar goal. These missions were not just scientific experiments, they were training grounds. American astronauts learned how to maneuver in space, how to dock spacecraft, how to survive weightlessness for days at a time. They practiced, iterated, failed, and tried again, and the world watched. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union continued to rack up firsts: the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, the first spacewalk by Alexei Leonov. But America had momentum. Each Mercury and Gemini mission brought it closer to mastering the choreography of spaceflight. And then came Apollo. If Mercury was the spark and Gemini the climb, Apollo was the leap. The program was monumental in scope and in spirit. Thousands of engineers, scientists, and workers across the country devoted themselves to the effort. Houston, Cape Canaveral, Huntsville, all became synonymous with space. American industry shifted into high gear, not for war this time, but for the stars. Yet Apollo was not just a symbol of American excellence. It was a stage on which the country could reassert its ideals to the world. At a time when civil rights were being fought in the streets and Vietnam raged across TV screens, Apollo offered something else: a unifying narrative, a collective goal, a moment where the country could look up together. And the moon was waiting. In 1968, Apollo 8 became the first crewed mission to orbit the moon. It was Christmas Eve, and as the spacecraft soared above the lunar surface, the astronauts read from Genesis, their voices crackling across a planet divided. They described a gray, cratered world outside their window. Lifeless, yes, but beautiful. And for the first time, humanity saw Earth from afar, a fragile blue marble hanging in darkness. The image, known as Earthrise, would change the way Americans and people everywhere thought about home. It was no longer just about beating the Soviets. It was about discovery, about perspective, about meaning. As the decade drew to a close, America stood at the edge of its most audacious moment. The moon was no longer a distant orb. It was a destination. The rockets were built. The astronauts were trained. The countdown had begun. On July 16th, 1969, the world watched as Apollo 11 lifted off from Cape Kennedy. Atop the towering Saturn V rocket, still the most powerful launch vehicle ever successfully flown, were three men: Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. They weren't just astronauts. In that moment, they were emissaries of a nation, representatives of a world holding its breath. The journey took 4 days. During that time, hundreds of millions of people followed every update, every transmission. Radio stations played their conversations. TV anchors explained trajectories. children were told to remember where they were when the landing happened, because they'd tell their grandchildren someday. On July 20th, the Eagle lunar module separated from the command module and began its descent. Alarms rang in the cockpit. Fuel ran low. Armstrong had to manually steer around boulders to find a safe landing site. The tension was unbearable. Then, at 4:17 p.m. Eastern Time, the words came through. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. It wasn't just a technical achievement. It was a cultural moment. One that belonged to America, yes, but also to the world. A triumph of human ingenuity, driven by a distinctly American urgency. The race to the moon had been political, but the arrival was poetic. A few hours later, Armstrong stepped onto the moon's surface. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The phrase echoed across the planet, broadcast in countless languages, across time zones, across ideologies. But what Armstrong and Aldrin did next was as symbolic as anything else. They planted a flag, not a United Nations flag, not a flag of Earth. An American flag, red, white, and blue, fluttering slightly in the vacuum due to the motions of the pole. That moment, frozen in photographs, in memory, in myth, crystallized something profound. It tied the stars to the stripes. It declared that this journey, this impossible dream, was made real not just by science, but by belief, by ambition, by a uniquely American drive to push forward. In that quiet, dusty plain, amid the desolation of the moon, the ideals of freedom, exploration, and unity stood taller than the flagpole itself. The space race had begun in competition, but in planting that flag, America didn't just win. It defined a new frontier, not just for itself, but for everyone. It began with a dream, but it ended with footprints, etched not in dust, but in the consciousness of a nation. The Apollo 11 mission wasn't just the final sprint of the space race. It was the culmination of centuries of ambition, sacrifice, and invention. From Galileo's telescope to the combustion engine, from Newton's equations to Kennedy's challenge, the road to the moon was paved with both theory and risk. And yet, when Neil Armstrong stepped off the Eagle onto the surface of the moon, the moment transformed from a geopolitical milestone into something far deeper. It became a myth, a memory, and a message from Earth to the cosmos. There were practical goals, of course, collecting samples, testing equipment, ensuring safe return. But layered beneath the procedures and protocols was something symbolic. The very presence of humans, American humans, on another celestial body carried weight. The flag they planted wasn't just for show. In the eyes of the world, it was a statement. Not of conquest, but of capability. not of territory, but of tenacity. Here was a country that less than 2 centuries after declaring its independence had stretched itself from sea to shining sea and then beyond the sky. The imprint America left on the moon was more than physical. Sure, the astronauts' boot prints are still there, undisturbed in the vacuum, unweathered by wind or rain. But what lingers more vividly is the emotional imprint, the psychological shift. For generations growing up after 1969, the moon was no longer unreachable. Children didn't just gaze at it in wonder. They pointed to it and said, "We've been there." And we, for many around the globe, meant America. That sense of awe didn't stem solely from the landing. It came from how the mission was framed. Live broadcasts, presidential speeches, ticker tapes, classroom discussions. The nation didn't merely send astronauts to the moon, it invited every citizen along for the ride. The whole country felt as though it had walked those alien steps, if only through grainy television screens and static-laced transmissions. The names, Armstrong, Aldrin, Collins, became not just astronauts, but American folk heroes, symbols of boldness, intelligence, and precision. The Apollo program, in its success, carved out a new kind of national identity, not just earthbound independence, but interstellar ambition. It's easy to look back now and see Apollo 11 as inevitable, as though it was simply the logical next step in a chain of events. But that's a trick of hindsight. In truth, the mission was filled with unknowns. Could the Saturn V launch reliably? Would the lunar module perform in the vacuum? Could the astronauts safely land and return? There were no guarantees, just calculations, courage, and belief. And that's part of what made the moment so potent. America didn't go to the moon because it was easy. It went, as President John F. Kennedy said, because it was hard. The very difficulty became the fuel. In a sense, the moon was just as much a test of national character as it was a feat of engineering. And while the entire Apollo 11 crew played essential roles, Neil Armstrong's first steps bore the heaviest symbolism. His words, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind," were rehearsed, yes, but genuine. They reflected not just a scientific triumph, but a unifying human moment. Still, for all the talk of mankind, the imagery was undeniably American. The flag planted in the regolith was not fluttering in wind. It couldn't, of course, but its presence was bold nonetheless. Engineers had rigged a crossbar to simulate the effect of unfurling. The red, white, and blue against the gray lunar soil created one of the most iconic visuals in history. It was a patriotic act, yes, but also a poetic one. In that barren quiet, the flag said what words couldn't. We made it. And back on Earth, millions watched. Entire families crowded around televisions. School children stopped classes. Even rival nations paused. For a moment, politics yielded to wonder. The moon landing became America's moment, but it was also a shared human story, broadcast to the world by American hands. That act of transmission, sending the story out from Houston to living rooms across the globe, wasn't trivial. It demonstrated that America's strength wasn't just in rockets, but in communication, in narrative, in crafting a message of hope and possibility. The moon became not just a place, but a canvas, and America painted its vision in bold strokes. But beyond the symbolism and spectacle, Apollo 11 was also a deeply technical milestone. It tested the limits of human physiology, machine precision, and psychological endurance. The astronauts operated in a realm of isolation that no human had experienced before, not just physically distant, but existentially so. Looking back at Earth from the moon, the planet appeared fragile, small, a shimmering sphere floating in the void. That perspective had a strange effect. It intensified both patriotism and humility. On one hand, Americans could justly celebrate what their nation had accomplished, a declaration of independence from the constraints of Earth. But on the other, many began to see Earth as a shared vessel. The image of the blue marble would follow in later missions, but the emotional groundwork was laid during Apollo 11. Back on the moon, the astronauts deployed scientific instruments, collected samples, and left behind a plaque that read, "We came in peace for all mankind." And yet, in the same soil, they placed the American flag. The message was dual-layered: universal aspiration, national achievement. The mission's success also rippled into sectors far beyond space. It catalyzed developments in materials, science, computer technology, and telecommunications. The systems that enabled Apollo 11 later seeded innovations that shaped everyday life. GPS, memory foam, and even medical imaging owe roots to the space race. And for America, Apollo 11 became a myth in the best sense. Not a distortion, but a story that binds identity. Every 4th of July, when fireworks light up the sky, they echo more than revolution. They echo propulsion, ascent, escape velocity. Independence became not just a political concept, but a physical trajectory. America didn't just declare its freedom on Earth. It stamped it onto the moon. Perhaps that's why Apollo 11 still resonates. It wasn't just about winning the race to space. It was about proving a point that a free nation, fueled by democratic ideals and scientific ambition, could reach farther than any empire before it, and in doing so, offer a glimpse of what unity could look like on a planetary, even cosmic, scale. The moon bears no atmosphere, no weather, no erosion. That means the footprints, the flag, the hardware, all of it, remain untouched. A still life of American determination. A monument not of stone, but of dust and silence under eternal sunlight. And though the flag does not wave, it speaks volumes. The American flag planted on the moon was a bold symbol, but perhaps the more enduring legacy of American space power lies in something invisible, the silent network of satellites orbiting far above our heads. In the years following Apollo, while rockets still launched and astronauts trained, the true backbone of the modern space era took shape quietly in low Earth orbit. America began to saturate the sky with satellites for weather, for science, for surveillance, and especially for communication. Today, it's hard to imagine life without them. GPS, international broadcasting, encrypted government transmissions all depend on this intricate infrastructure humming silently in space. But satellites are not just tools, they are extensions of national power. Their presence draws the boundary between sovereignty and surveillance, between global unity and geopolitical tension. And here, again, the theme of independence finds its echo in the stars. When the first American satellite, Explorer 1, launched in 1958, it didn't just carry a payload, it carried intent. It marked a shift from earthbound exploration to orbital dominance. Just months after the Soviet Union's Sputnik had pierced the silence of space, America responded with its own declaration, not on paper, but in orbit. From that point on, space became a new domain of sovereignty. Nations didn't own territory up there, but they did stake their presence. And the U.S., through a mixture of innovation and persistence, ensured it would never again be caught off guard. As the Cold War raged, American satellites became silent sentinels. Some scanned the weather for hurricanes, others tracked enemy missile sites. Spy satellites, operating under top-secret programs like Corona, returned grainy black and white photos that changed foreign policy in real time. Satellites reduced uncertainty, and in doing so, they became instruments of peace, paradoxically stabilizing a world that could easily spiral into nuclear conflict. But satellites also democratized knowledge. NASA's Landsat program, launched in the 1970s, gave scientists the ability to monitor crops, glaciers, and wildfires from above. America didn't keep this data to itself. It shared it with the world, a gesture both scientific and political. In a way, satellites are the ultimate expression of modern freedom. They allow us to see beyond borders, to communicate across continents, and to navigate the planet with precision. Yet with this power came responsibility. The skies, once so vast, began to crowd. By the end of the 20th century, tens of thousands of objects orbited Earth, many of them launched by the United States. Some were operational, others were not. Some served civilian goals, others military. And amid this growing complexity, America began shaping the norms of orbital conduct. It wasn't always about dominance. Sometimes it was about setting the rules. In the 1960s and 70s, the U.S. helped spearhead international treaties that defined how space would be used, not as a battlefield, but as a shared domain. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, signed by America and dozens of other nations, declared that no one could claim ownership of celestial bodies. It also forbade the placement of nuclear weapons in orbit. Still, the line between peace and power was never clear-cut. American reconnaissance satellites operated above Soviet territory with impunity, protected not by physical shields, but by a fragile mutual understanding. Both superpowers knew the risks of shooting down each other's eyes in the sky, and so they watched, and were watched in a strange equilibrium. Fast forward to today, and American satellites continue to define the modern world. The Global Positioning System, GPS, born from a military project, now guides billions of phones, cars, and aircraft around the planet. Its precision, down to meters, even centimeters, reshaped agriculture, shipping, disaster response, and war itself. GPS became a tool of independence, allowing nations to coordinate, navigate, and trade with greater freedom than ever before. But this independence is fragile. As reliance grows, so does vulnerability. Solar flares, cyber attacks, even orbital debris pose real threats to these networks. And so, America invests not just in launching satellites, but in protecting them, building shields of software and policy, redundancy, and resilience. There's also a renewed race for orbital territory. Private companies like SpaceX, through initiatives like Starlink, are flooding the sky with thousands of communication satellites. America isn't just shaping space policy anymore. It's shaping the infrastructure of the next internet from orbit. And with that comes not only innovation, but questions about regulation, ownership, and control. In this web of machines circling the Earth, American ideals echo faintly of openness, of innovation, and of liberty. But they must be constantly reaffirmed, not through words alone, but through how we use and share the sky. And yet, amid all this technology, a quieter legacy emerges, one not often mentioned in patriotic speeches or space race documentaries. It's the fact that American satellites are listening, not just to enemy transmissions, but to Earth itself. From high above, they measure the rise of oceans, the retreat of glaciers, the carbon in our atmosphere. NASA's Earth-observing fleet became a scientific mirror, showing humanity how it's reshaping the only home it knows. These satellites do not wave flags, but their data empowers global responses to climate change, disasters, and disease. In this sense, American space power serves not only sovereignty, but stewardship. In 2020, NASA launched Sentinel-6 Michael Freilich, a satellite designed to monitor sea level rise with unmatched precision. Though it carries American technology, it operates in partnership with Europe and other global agencies. It's a quiet signal that even as nations pursue their interests in space, the planet below remains shared. Still, the question of sovereignty persists. In a future where space commerce booms, with asteroid mining, lunar tourism, and Mars colonization on the horizon, who decides what's fair? America's early dominance gives it a louder voice in shaping that answer. And its values, whether enshrined in treaties or embedded in algorithms, may determine how the next frontier unfolds. As we reflect on America's legacy in orbit, it's clear that freedom in space is not just about escape velocity. It's about vision, about believing that science and independence are not in conflict, but partners in the same ascent. That the same country that declared liberty in 1776 could 2 centuries later declare its presence among the stars. Satellites may be silent, but they reflect a nation's will to explore, to observe, and to protect. Above the earth, beneath the stars, they are America's quietest declaration. We are here, we are watching, and we believe the sky belongs to all. It's an image etched into the American psyche. An astronaut, dust-covered and solemn, raising the stars and stripes on the surface of the moon. In that moment, the United States did not simply land on another world. It left a symbol behind, a statement, not of conquest, but of presence and of hope. But what does it mean to plant a flag in a place where no one lives, where no borders exist, no governments rule, and no armies march? For America, that act on July 20th, 1969, was not just about beating the Soviets to the moon. It was about declaring, in silence and in stillness, that freedom had found a way to reach beyond Earth. The Apollo 11 flag was made of nylon. It had no official funding line in the mission budget. Engineers scrambled to design a simple mechanism to make it stand upright in lunar gravity. The astronauts themselves struggled to anchor it in the regolith. And yet, that fragile pole, planted in haste, became one of the most enduring icons of the 20th century. And it raised a question that still lingers. Whose moon is it? Under the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, to which the U.S. is a key signatory, no nation may claim sovereignty over any celestial body. Planting a flag doesn't mean ownership, but it does mean something. It marks a moment in time, a human footprint in the void. And when that flag is American, it also marks a cultural imprint, a technological triumph, and a political promise. That promise was echoed in every Apollo mission that followed, By 1972, 6 U.S. flags stood on the moon, each a quiet chapter in the saga of space exploration. Some have since fallen, bleached white by ultraviolet radiation. But the legacy remains. The moon remembers. Beyond symbolism, there's also a deeper conversation about the ethics of leaving human marks on untouched worlds. Is flag planting an act of pride or presumption? For America, the gesture was born not only of Cold War urgency, but of a deeper narrative that exploration, when driven by ideals rather than conquest, becomes a universal good. As NASA prepares to return humans to the moon under the Artemis program, the discussion resurfaces. Will another flag be raised? Should it? Some argue that in this new era of international cooperation, where astronauts from many nations may walk together on lunar soil, a shared emblem, perhaps the United Nations or a mission-specific logo, might be more appropriate. Yet it's hard to imagine an American mission without the stars and stripes somewhere in view, not as a claim, but as an echo of history, as a symbol of the same democratic values that sent Apollo 11 soaring over 50 years ago. Then there's Mars. The red planet has long captured American imagination in pulp fiction, in movies, in science. Now it stands as the next great leap. Rovers like Spirit, Opportunity, and Perseverance have already carried small American flags to its surface, etched on their equipment. But when humans arrive, as NASA, SpaceX, and others envision, the question will return. What do we leave behind? Will we plant a flag again? If so, what will it mean? There's a difference between exploration and colonization. Planting a flag on Mars may one day be viewed not as a claim to territory, but as a milestone in the human story, the moment when life from Earth set foot on another world. And when that footstep wears an American boot, it carries the legacy of July 4th with it, of Jefferson, of Lincoln, of Kennedy, and of Armstrong. In a strange way, every American flag sent beyond Earth tells two stories. One is of ambition, the rockets, the billions spent, the silent calculations that bend metal and fire to human will. The other is of reflection, that the more we reach outward, the more we ask what kind of species we are and who we choose to be when no one is watching. The moon is silent. Mars is silent. Space listens, but it does not reply. So we speak through symbols. The flag planted on the moon didn't flutter in a breeze, because there is no breeze. It was held up by a rod, stiff and still. But in every frame of that image, in every textbook and documentary, it waves in the human mind. It says, "We were here, and we came in peace." As America moves forward into a new century of spaceflight, with private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin, and with new generations of astronauts whose names the world will soon know, the flag remains, not as a marker of ownership, but as a reminder of promise. On this 4th of July, as fireworks echo under the same stars that guided Apollo to Tranquility Base, the meaning of that promise feels clearer. The stars on the flag match the stars above. The courage that lit them burns still, and perhaps one day, on distant moons or under alien skies, someone will see a faint fabric pressed into ancient dust and remember not just a nation, but a time when humans believed that unity, bravery, and freedom could ride a rocket and leave a footprint on forever. If there is one figure who captures the spirit of American space exploration, it's the astronaut, a symbol stitched into the national imagination with the same precision as the stars on the flag they wear. From the earliest Mercury flights to the lunar strides of Apollo, from space shuttle missions to today's journeys aboard SpaceX capsules, the American astronaut has become more than just a pilot or scientist. They are a kind of modern explorer, crossing not oceans, but the silence between worlds. But this image wasn't born overnight. It was crafted by politics, by media, and by the very real courage of the people who stepped into those suits. It began with Alan Shepard, America's first man in space, who rode a suborbital arc in 1961 and returned to Earth to applause and expectation. It grew with John Glenn, who orbited the planet and became a national hero. And it crystallized with Neil Armstrong, whose words on the moon were broadcast into nearly every living room across the country. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Armstrong wasn't just stepping into lunar dust. He was stepping into a myth, one carefully shaped by the forces of the Cold War, by Kennedy's soaring rhetoric, and by America's deep desire to prove something to the world. That desire, born in the crucible of rivalry, gave rise to an entire generation of astronauts whose names are now etched into history. Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, Sally Ride, Mae Jemison, Chris Hadfield, and so many more. But beyond the mythos is the human, the astronaut as a person. Inside the suit, behind the mirrored visor, are the eyes of individuals trained not only to endure the physical demands of spaceflight, but to carry the emotional and symbolic weight of a nation's ambition. The NASA Astronaut Corps became more than just a team. It became a national narrative. During the Apollo era, astronauts were largely drawn from the ranks of military test pilots. They were engineers with nerves of steel, chosen as much for their ability to perform under pressure as for their public image. They trained in simulators that pushed their minds and bodies to the edge, rehearsed emergency scenarios again and again, and faced the possibility, even the likelihood, of not coming home. But over the decades, that image evolved. With the rise of the Space Shuttle program, astronauts became scientists, doctors, and educators. They conducted complex experiments in orbit. They repaired satellites and built the International Space Station piece by piece. They became emissaries, not just of American might, but of international cooperation. The image of the astronaut was reshaped too, from the stoic, press conference ready figure of the 1960s to more diverse, open, and relatable personalities in the 21st century. The first American woman in space, Sally Ride, shattered a barrier and became an icon. Guion Bluford, the first African American in space, helped expand the definition of what an astronaut looked like. And Franklin Chang Diaz, Kalpana Chawla, and Victor Glover continued that arc, each carrying with them stories that deepened the meaning of exploration in an American context. Being an astronaut was no longer just about proving something to an adversary. It became about reaching further for the sake of knowledge, for unity, for the future. Still, even in this era of scientific diplomacy and international space stations, the American astronaut has remained a powerful emblem of national pride, especially on days like Independence Day. When footage of spacewalks plays during celebrations, when names like Neil Armstrong and Mae Jemison are echoed in classrooms and parades, they connect spaceflight to a deeper American narrative, one of freedom, perseverance, and daring to lead. This symbolism hasn't faded in the commercial age. When SpaceX, a private American company founded by Elon Musk, launched NASA astronauts aboard the Crew Dragon to the ISS, it rekindled a patriotic flame. The moment astronauts stepped out of a capsule made not by a government agency, but by a U.S. startup using a rocket built on American soil, the nation took notice. Even their names, Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken, became briefly etched into the cultural memory. Flags flew higher. Commentators invoked echoes of Apollo, because once again, Americans had lifted off from home ground. Yet this modern chapter also brought with it a new kind of astronaut, one trained in partnership with AI, robotics, and mission systems more advanced than anything imagined in the early days. They are no longer just passengers or pilots. They are systems managers, diplomats, and in a very real way, the faces of Earth. And in all of this, from Mercury to Artemis, one thing has remained constant. The astronaut stands as proof of what America dares to imagine. They are reminders that the stars are not out of reach, that independence once declared in ink can be reaffirmed in motion through rockets launched, planets studied, and knowledge pursued beyond borders. They are the embodiment of a promise that exploration is not just for kings or empires, but for a republic forged in revolution, committed to the freedom of thought and discovery. This 4th of July, when fireworks echo across neighborhoods and the sky glows in bursts of color, there will be Americans orbiting hundreds of miles above Earth. They'll be floating, tethered to nothing but trust in their training, their ship, their nation. And that too is a kind of flag planted, not in soil, but in silence, not on a battlefield, but in the blackness between stars. A quiet affirmation that the spirit of the American astronaut is still out there, watching, learning, pushing outward. Space has never belonged to one nation alone, but for many Americans, the cosmos feels like something deeply personal, woven into childhood dreams, stitched into movies, printed on cereal boxes, and remembered in the collective memory of a nation that once watched a man walk the moon on live TV. From its founding in 1958, NASA was never just a science agency. It was a storyteller. Its missions, Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, were given names from myth, not manuals. Its spacecraft looked like science fiction. Its engineers wore pocket protectors, but spoke with the gravitas of poets. And in American living rooms, black and white at first, later glowing with color, the space agency became more than real. It became aspirational. During the Cold War, NASA's achievements weren't just technical victories, they were political declarations. When the Apollo 11 crew lifted off in July 1969, America wasn't just trying to beat the Soviets, it was demonstrating that freedom breeds innovation. The lunar landing became the ultimate Independence Day sequel, played out in the vacuum of space. But unlike military campaigns, NASA's battles were fought with equations, aluminum, and courage. No enemy was killed, no territory conquered. Instead, the American flag was planted not as a mark of ownership, but of presence. "We came in peace for all mankind," the plaque on the lunar module declared, a line written by a country that had just endured a decade of war, unrest, and civil upheaval. And still, somehow, Americans believed. As the decades passed, the space shuttle brought the stars even closer. Children across America watched Challenger launch astronauts into orbit like a giant school bus. Posters of Voyager, Hubble, and Mars rovers filled science classrooms. Astronauts became celebrities, and the acronym NASA, once a bureaucratic label, turned into a brand of awe. It wasn't just for scientists anymore. NASA's entered pop culture, from Star Trek and Star Wars to cereal boxes with freeze-dried astronaut ice cream. The cosmos became consumable. You didn't need a PhD to dream about Mars. You just needed a backyard telescope or a spark of curiosity. During the 1990s and early 2000s, NASA's reach into public life evolved. The Hubble Space Telescope revealed images that stunned the world: pillars of gas like cathedral ruins, infant stars wrapped in dust. For many Americans, these weren't just discoveries, they were spiritual moments. Proof that the universe was vast, beautiful, and somehow within reach. And yet, NASA remained taxpayer-funded, accountable to Congress, bound by budget. In times of economic strain, the agency had to fight to justify its existence. Why spend money on stars when there are problems here on Earth? But the American imagination never let go. In public surveys, NASA consistently ranked among the most trusted government institutions. Why? Because it didn't just promise results, it promised wonder. In the 21st century, this relationship deepened. With the rise of the internet, NASA's discoveries became instantly shareable. A photo from the James Webb Space Telescope could land on millions of screens within minutes, no filters needed. NASA began live streaming launches, offering virtual tours of mission control and creating open datasets that invited anyone, even teenagers, to explore the cosmos on their laptops. Public engagement became the mission. Citizen science projects let ordinary people classify galaxies, track asteroids, and even help name distant planets. It wasn't just outreach, it was ownership. On the 4th of July, when Americans celebrate liberty and self-determination, there's something deeply resonant in this model. NASA doesn't hoard knowledge behind locked doors. It shares it. Because in this country, science isn't meant to be a privilege. It's a public good. The stars may be silent, but thanks to NASA, their stories are now told in every classroom, every living room, every curious mind that looks up and wonders, what's out there? And in that wonder, America finds its reflection, not in conquest, but in curiosity, not in territory claimed, but in questions asked. That's how a space agency became a mirror of a nation's ideals. Open, ambitious, restless, free. It began, as many things in the modern world do, with a beep. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. It was small, about the size of a beach ball, and yet its signal echoed across the globe like a warning shot. America, newly comfortable in its post-war dominance, suddenly felt vulnerable. The sky had been breached, not by planes or missiles, but by information. What followed was not just a technological race, but an ideological one. Satellites, in their earliest form, became silent symbols of power. They orbited the Earth with quiet precision, but carried loud meaning. For the United States, the response had to be swift, and it had to match American ideals. If the Soviets had Sputnik, America would build Explorer. But more than that, America would build a system. And so, within months, the US launched its own satellite and laid the groundwork for a space infrastructure that would ultimately span defense, science, and communication. The Cold War may have been fought in shadows, but one of its brightest arenas was above the clouds, in orbit. Yet as the 1960s unfolded, something curious happened. These satellites, initially envisioned for surveillance and national security, found other uses, peaceful ones. They began monitoring weather, tracking hurricanes, relaying television signals, mapping terrain, gathering data not just for military strategists, but for farmers, students, meteorologists, and eventually everyday citizens. This was a turning point. What began as a race for dominance was morphing into a network for knowledge. One of the key developments came with the launch of the Landsat program in 1972. It was the first civilian satellite designed to study Earth from space, not to spy, not to intimidate, but to learn. And that, in its essence, was a declaration of values. America was saying, space is not just a military frontier. It is a tool for humanity. Landsat began beaming back images of forests, oceans, cities, and deserts. Scientists could track deforestation, glacial retreat, and urban growth. Farmers could assess crop health. Governments could plan infrastructure. And over time, these images were released to the public, not locked behind classified seals, but shared freely. That decision to make satellite data open was both political and philosophical. It aligned with America's democratic ethos, the belief that information should empower the many, not the few. In an age when knowledge was increasingly power, the U.S. chose transparency as a strength. Not all nations followed suit. Some kept their space data secret. Others used their satellites strictly for surveillance or propaganda. But the United States, from the 1970s onward, carved out a different path, a kind of orbital openness. The satellite became not just an eye in the sky, but a mirror for the planet. It's no exaggeration to say that this shaped the modern world. Environmental policy, disaster response, climate science, all now rely on the kind of satellite data that began with programs like Landsat. And all of it flowed from a Cold War reaction that evolved into something more enduring. The belief that space, like speech, should be free. As technology advanced, so did America's commitment to open access. The 1980s and 1990s saw the growth of GPS, originally developed by the U.S. Department of Defense for military navigation. But in the early 2000s, a pivotal decision was made to offer full access to GPS signals for civilian use, without degradation or subscription. This decision would transform daily life across the globe. Navigation systems in cars, smartphones, and ships all rely on that invisible constellation of American satellites. It was a gesture not of domination, but of invitation, an infrastructure of freedom, silently supporting billions. Here again, we see how space and liberty intertwine in the American imagination. GPS became a form of planetary infrastructure, but also an extension of democratic ideals. It was reliable, precise, and, crucially, available to everyone. No gatekeeping, no exclusivity, just global utility. This pattern repeated in the data from weather satellites too. From GOES to NOAA systems, American satellites began sharing critical storm, climate, and atmospheric data with international partners. During hurricanes, droughts, or volcanic eruptions, this open flow of information became a lifeline, often the difference between preparedness and catastrophe. And while some might argue that this openness diluted strategic advantage, the United States held to a larger vision. That leadership in space came not just from power, but from principles. Of course, not all satellite activity followed this noble path. Surveillance satellites, essential tools of national security, remain classified, their operations cloaked in secrecy. But even here, the ethos is different. These assets exist in a system where checks, balances, and civilian oversight ensure that freedom is not sacrificed in the name of safety. In the post-Cold War era, as private companies entered the space arena, the American approach to satellites matured again. Firms like Planet Labs, Maxar, and SpaceX began launching constellations of satellites that extended the freedom of information ethos beyond government. Farmers in Kenya can now track crop health from satellite data. Climate researchers in Scandinavia access wildfire alerts sourced from American private imaging systems. Journalists, activists, educators all now have tools that just decades ago were the guarded privilege of superpowers. This privatization didn't represent a retreat from national values. In many ways, it was an extension of them. The American marketplace of ideas moved into orbit, governed by both innovation and ideals. Space was no longer just a frontier. It became a platform for liberty. On the 4th of July, we often think of liberty in terms of speech, religion, or assembly. But there's a quieter freedom embedded in the stars above us, the freedom to see, to understand, to prepare. Satellites offer that, silently circling Earth, beaming down their impartial truths. And that, too, is a legacy of American independence. Not just to break away from tyranny, but to build a world where truth flows freely from Earth and from space. Not every symbol of American freedom is cast in marble or ink. Some are built from concrete and steel, facing east toward the ocean, where rockets rise like declarations into the sky. Cape Canaveral, Vandenberg, Wallops Island, Kennedy Space Center. These aren't just geographic locations. They are places where America's cosmic aspirations are forged, not in theory, but in flame. Launch pads are quite literally the platforms where the nation's dreams are tested and where the countdown to discovery begins. Cape Canaveral was already hosting missile tests when, in the early days of the space race, it became the epicenter of America's space ambitions. In 1960, President Eisenhower transferred operations to the newly formed NASA, turning the Cape into something bigger, not just a military installation, but a national stage. From this patch of Florida coastline, the Mercury astronauts first flew. From here, Gemini and Apollo roared skyward. Here, Neil Armstrong left Earth to take that first step on the moon. Here, shuttles launched, exploded, returned, and launched again. Every countdown echoed something deeper, a defiance of limits. Each flame that poured from the rocket bell beneath was fueled by more than kerosene. It burned with the idea that a free nation, given time and ingenuity, could leap past Earth's grip. Just a few miles north, Kennedy Space Center became the icon, the place where America looked up. Its towering vehicle assembly building, one of the largest buildings in the world, became a temple of motion. Here, rockets are not just assembled, they are consecrated, raised vertically like monuments to human effort. Each launch from Kennedy has carried not just machinery and crew, but the attention of a country. Children in classrooms, citizens on rooftops, reporters packed shoulder to shoulder on the press causeway. For decades, the shuttle program made spaceflight feel routine, and then reminded us, with tragedy, that it never is. After the Challenger accident in 1986 and Columbia in 2003, the nation mourned collectively. Flags flew at half-mast, not just for lost lives, but for the vulnerability of dreams. Still, the pads stood ready. Still, America returned, adjusting, refining, never giving up. Across the country, Vandenberg Air Force Base offered a different kind of launch toward polar orbits and reconnaissance. It's here that military and commercial satellites launched into paths that circle the Earth from pole to pole, giving the U.S. eyes in the sky and voices across oceans. But these launch pads are more than infrastructure. They are stages for shared memory. From Mercury to Artemis, they've marked the pulse of the American space narrative, a heartbeat that accelerates with each countdown. In recent years, a new kind of American energy has joined the story. Private companies, once spectators, now command center stage. SpaceX launches its Falcon rockets from the same pads once used for Apollo. Blue Origin, founded with patriotic language and frontier imagery, tests its reusable rockets in Texas, echoing cowboy mythologies under vast desert skies. This merging of public and private speaks to a foundational idea in American culture, that innovation doesn't belong to the state alone. That freedom includes the freedom to build, to try, to reach higher than regulations once imagined. Yet even as SpaceX lands its boosters with ballet-like precision, the symbolism remains rooted. Each flame licking the Florida sky is still powered by a national hope. Each countdown still ends with the same collective inhale, and when those rockets rise, they carry more than payloads. They carry meaning. They lift the idea, written in Philadelphia, defended at Gettysburg, tested in Selma, that the future is something to be built, not feared. Even the names of these sites echo with intent. Cape Canaveral, Kennedy Space Center, Vandenberg. They are more than coordinates. They are declarations that this land, this country, this people choose to lift their eyes and build the means to touch the stars. And what other nation, on what other day, could call such ambition patriotic rather than presumptuous? What other place ties rocket science not just to science, but to spirit? July 4th is often celebrated with fireworks, explosions of light across the sky. But at these launch pads, America writes fireworks into history itself. The launches aren't just displays of power, they are expressions of continuity, from muskets to moonshots, and in the controlled chaos of ignition, there's a whisper of the Declaration of Independence, not spoken, but thundered into the sky. We hold these truths to be self-evident, because in every liftoff, America says again, we will not stay grounded. Not in thought, not in dream, not in destiny. This chapter, these launch pads, these soaring machines, they all tell the same story, that liberty, in its truest form, is not just a political condition, it's a direction, upward. There's a quiet echo that trails every boot print left on the moon, a question that hovers in the stillness like lunar dust. What comes next? When Neil Armstrong stepped off the Eagle and into history, it wasn't just a moment of arrival, it was the beginning of a longer walk, still unfinished. The dream of space exploration was never about stopping at one giant leap. It was about a long journey, one that stretches beyond the moon, across the solar system, and toward our closest planetary neighbor, Mars. Mars has always been more than a distant red light in the night sky. It is the horizon line of human imagination, a symbol of what comes after the impossible becomes real. And for the United States, Mars has become the next chapter in the same story that began with the Declaration of Independence, a bold refusal to accept limits. In the decades since Apollo, the vision of reaching Mars has shifted from science fiction to structured plans. NASA's Artemis program, which aims to return Americans to the moon, is explicitly a stepping stone, not a final destination. The moon is once again a proving ground, a training camp, a launch pad for the true journey ahead. In many ways, Mars is our cosmic frontier, as symbolically rich as the western horizon was to the pioneers of the 1800s. Just as those settlers crossed plains and rivers to claim new ground, the dream of Mars pushes us to cross oceans of blackness, to test the boundaries of biology, engineering, and willpower. It is no coincidence that American space policy continues to cast Mars in the light of manifest destiny, not of conquest, but of expansion, of learning, and of placing human boots where none have walked. And there is something uniquely American in the way this vision has been pursued. Private industry, once a secondary player in the space race, now stands at the center of the mission. Companies like SpaceX have reframed the conversation from if we can go to Mars to how soon we'll get there. Elon Musk's Mars-centric vision, colonization, sustainability, interplanetary society, may sound extreme, but it resonates with an American tradition of scaling the improbable. This blend of public ambition and private drive is part of what makes the Mars dream so distinctively American. NASA's Perseverance rover, currently roaming the Jezero crater, is not just a science lab on wheels. It's a signal to the world that America is preparing the soil, literally and figuratively, for a future human presence. When Ingenuity, the small helicopter that came along for the ride, took its first flight, it was the first powered aircraft to fly on another planet, another Wright brothers moment under the stars and stripes. This Mars ambition carries more than scientific curiosity. It echoes national pride. Political leaders reference it in speeches, comparing it to the moon landing as the next great step for the United States. The very idea of sending humans to Mars is woven into campaign promises, defense budgets, and public imagination, and every mention circles back to the same theme: America must lead. But leadership on Mars isn't only about who gets there first. It's about what kind of presence we establish. NASA's Artemis program, while focused on returning to the moon, is designed as a stepping stone to Mars. It's a strategy of permanence, infrastructure, and presence. A plan that prioritizes longevity over flags and footprints. And even here, America is setting the pace. Culturally, the idea of Mars resonates deeply with Americans. From early pulp science fiction to modern cinema, Mars has often been the planet of struggle, freedom, survival, and hope. It's the red canvas upon which Americans have projected fears and fantasies for over a century. And now, we are watching that fiction evolve into logistics, fuel depots, radiation shielding, habitat design. What once was the stage for alien battles is now the framework for real engineering briefs at NASA and SpaceX headquarters. The engineering effort alone is monumental. Life support systems must endure not weeks, but years. Propulsion must carry not just equipment, but people safely through months of radiation exposure. Every supply chain, every safety measure must be reimagined, because no one can bring a stranded crew home from Mars in days like Apollo 13. It is the ultimate test, not only of hardware, but of human willpower and American resolve. Private industry, especially companies like SpaceX, has taken up the challenge alongside NASA. Elon Musk's Starship isn't just a rocket, it's a declaration of intent. Its massive scale, its reusability, its potential to ferry not just astronauts, but entire cargo modules, all of it speaks to a future where American innovation doesn't just reach Mars, it thrives there. And though private, these missions carry American flags, speak American English, and are broadcast with the same patriotic fervor once reserved for Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. This vision is more than a technological conquest. It's symbolic. To reach Mars is to carry the very essence of American pioneering spirit into the next frontier. It's a continuation of the same thread that carried settlers west, aviators across oceans, astronauts to the moon. Now, that thread stretches tens of millions of miles across cold, empty space, tying our history to our future. Yet the Mars dream is not without debate. Critics argue the cost is too high, the risk too great, or that Earth needs fixing first. But such doubts have always shadowed great ventures. Jefferson faced them when doubling the nation through the Louisiana Purchase. Lincoln heard them when he committed to preserving the Union. Kennedy silenced them with a single sentence: "We choose to go to the moon." And now, the echo of that spirit calls us once again, not to retreat, but to rise. Because in truth, Mars is not just about Mars. It's about proving that America, for all its flaws and challenges, still believes in doing hard things. It's about showing that freedom, real freedom, includes the ability to pursue wonder, to explore beyond the limits, to imagine and then build the future. In the reddish dust of that distant world, there lies a mirror. In it, we see our courage, our ambition, our unity when we choose to be bold. Every bolt of a Martian lander, every minute of simulated gravity, every grain of regolith examined, it all speaks not just to science, but to soul. The journey from the moon to Mars is not a detour from the American story. It's its next chapter. And one day, perhaps not long from now, another boot will touch alien soil. Another flag, red, white, and blue, will be unfurled against an alien sky. And when that moment comes, it will not just be a victory for science or for policy. It will be Independence Day all over again. The stars were always there, long before rockets, long before telescopes, before July 4ths and declarations signed in ink. They shimmered quietly above, ancient, unreachable, eternal. Humanity looked up and saw destiny. America looked up and saw purpose. When the 13 colonies declared independence in 1776, they weren't merely cutting ties with a crown. They were announcing a belief that people could govern themselves, dream boldly, and build a nation from principles, not power. That belief traveled by ship and rail and wire, across continents and oceans, and eventually it traveled into space. From the parchment of the Declaration to the panels of a space shuttle, the journey was not inevitable. It was chosen. Each generation of Americans decided to keep building towards something larger than themselves. In factories, in fields, in classrooms, in labs, on launch pads. And when Apollo 11 lifted off in July of 1969, just days after another celebration of Independence Day, it wasn't just a scientific mission, it was a national expression. This is who we are. This is what freedom dares to do. That rocket carried not just astronauts, but the weight of centuries, of revolutionaries, of soldiers, of suffragettes, and of dreamers. It carried the prayers of immigrants and the hopes of children who had never seen a star without city lights. It carried the soul of a people who had always refused to stay still, because space, for America, was never about escape. It was about expansion of knowledge, of possibility, of what it means to be human and free. The flag planted on the moon wasn't just a symbol of national pride. It was a declaration of values, that in a cold, lifeless place, humanity could still bring warmth, that even in the silence of space, the voice of liberty could echo. Many around the world watched the moon landing with awe, but for Americans, it struck a deeper chord. It wasn't just an achievement of science, it was a fulfillment of promise. The same promise that rang out from Independence Hall, that a people united by ideals could do the impossible. And since then, the stars have remained not as boundaries, but invitations. Each new mission, to Mars, to Europa, to the edge of the solar system, carries with it that same spirit. When the Perseverance rover touched Martian soil, it wasn't just a triumph of engineering. It was a quiet whisper across time. We are still reaching. We are still becoming. And back on Earth is every 4th of July. The skies fill with fireworks, fleeting bursts of light, bright against the dark. They're beautiful, yes, but they're also reminders that from the earliest days, America has believed in lighting the night, in making bold declarations, in never settling for the sky as a limit. From the first telescope to the James Webb, from Newton's equations to Einstein's curves in space-time, the cosmos has slowly revealed itself. But so has America, a country constantly reshaping, redefining, reinventing. The story of space and the story of this country are entwined. Both are vast, unfinished, full of peril and beauty. So when we talk about the stars on this 4th of July, whether the 50 on the flag or the billions beyond our atmosphere, we're really talking about something deeper, not just where we've been, but who we are. Every mission, every rover, every astronaut floating in the silence of space, they carry more than science. They carry history. They carry intention. They carry the long echo of that first declaration that liberty matters, that progress matters, and that a free people can and must reach for more. From Cape Canaveral to the Sea of Tranquility, from firecrackers to rocket launches, from parchment signatures to interstellar signals, the American journey has never stayed earthbound. Because independence is not just freedom from tyranny, it's freedom to imagine, freedom to explore, freedom to stand beneath a sky full of stars and say, we will not stop here. And that, more than anything, is what the 4th of July means, not just to a nation, but to a species that still dares to dream.